Well, thanks, Marcia, for that introduction. Can I acknowledge country and the Onu people? This is the first time I visited your land, and it's a privilege to see firsthand your continued, your strong and your resilient culture. My name's Jennifer Westacott, and as Marcia said, I'm actually the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. You get to be chair when you've retired from life and then you come back. The Council is the policy and advocacy body which represents 130 of Australia's largest companies. I grew up in the Central Coast of New South Wales and now live in Sydney. As Marcia said, we've got Peter Nash, the Chairman of KPMG, Mark Smith, the Group Executive of Perpetual Private, and David Linberg, the Chief Executive of Westpac Business Bank, and I'm going to chair this session with Marcia. So what's the purpose of our panel this afternoon? We want to discuss the role of business in Indigenous economic development and all that should go with that. We want to talk about what we've learned, what can be done better, and how we can share those learnings with other sectors. There are two things to start this discussion with. The first is this, that business has not always been on the right side of the land rights debate. And as Gulkula said this morning, we're still not always on the right side of that debate. The second point is that land rights have not translated into economic power for Indigenous people. So because of this, we must accept Gulkula's gracious invitation for business and the Indigenous community to sit down and make sure that land rights produce real economic power and in turn realise a stronger nation overall. So if we talk about economic activity as a context, my starting point is this afternoon is that if done properly, economic activity, by that I mean jobs, wealth creation, is essential for social progress because it creates freedom, it creates choice, it creates a capacity to invest in improving living standards, and I would argue it is absolutely central to the restoration, the preservation and the creation of dignity for individuals and their families, for communities and for nations themselves. And I believe that business is essential to achieve this. In fact, I don't just believe it, I absolutely know it. And I know the people here who work every day to promote economic development absolutely know it. Business should be the natural ally in overcoming some of the issues that we've discussed today. Why? Because they take risks. They actually don't think in terms of programs, they think in terms of results. They think long term, not 5 years, and they know that the failure to invest in the potential of people will result in a failure of the company. But if we're going to get this right, let's be clear about what business is and what business isn't. Businesses, large, small, medium, Indigenous, corporate, can only survive if they make profits over the long term, if they can adjust to competition and change, and if they return money to their investors who have put their money at risk. But to have enduring success, we need to create a shared value. What do I mean by that? Well, things that create value for the business, while at the same time having real positive and measurable benefits to communities, to society and to the environment. This is not corporate social responsibility, it's not philanthropy, it's not charity, it's core business. And we can do this a lot better. Firstly, we can deepen employment relationships, we can create more real long-term jobs. We can deepen supplier relationships, and this morning the Business Council members got together and talked about setting more ambitious targets for supplier relationships. We can create other businesses. We can respectfully and carefully partner with the Indigenous community in advocacy over things like education, over things like constitutional recognition. We can build capacity and skills, and we can unleash the digital economy. There is enormous potential, and it's blind to remoteness, it's blind to history. And of course, we can get rid of our own red tape, our procurement terms, our payment terms, our contract terms. But business needs to have partners to do this. So I know we can do a lot better, but so can others. From my experience in government, can I make these suggestions to the public service and to government? Please make it easier. Please move to an investment model not a paternalistic program model. Get rid of some of the rules because they won't work, they don't work, they've never worked, and they can't be adapted to local communities. You cannot have innovation, you cannot have wealth creation in a rigid program model designed by one group of people for another. So before I hand over to my panel partners, I think we're making some progress here. I'm optimistic and I'm proud of what our member companies are achieving. If I think back, in 2009, 30% of our members were involved in some kind of quite structured Indigenous engagement strategy. Now it is 85%. As Marcia said, we are creating 17,000 jobs, $1.7 billion in supplier contracts. The chance, the opportunity is to build on that and do better, and of course we must do better. So let me start by handing over to Peter. Peter, with both hats on, you're Reconciliation Australia and as your chair of KPMG, one of the first firms, and I say that proudly as a former partner of KPMG, to develop a RAP. What have you learned as a firm and what are the changes that have happened in corporate Australia with regard to Indigenous engagement over time?
Well, I think in terms of the very start, I think over the last decade or perhaps a little bit longer, business has become much more aware of its broader social role, the broader social context, and there is a much better understanding that business simply cannot prosper unless the communities in which it operates prosper as well. So there is a very, very strong mutual alignment there that hasn't always been understood. And I think there's also been an emerging understanding over that same period that one of the more opportune aspects of the challenges faced by Indigenous Australia is that of economic empowerment. And that economic empowerment is something that business, as Jennifer has just pointed out, has a fundamental role to play. In fact, a role far more so than government has to play. And business is the driver of economic activity. So at least in KPMG's case, and I think in many other bases, in many other cases, concurrent with understanding or an enhanced understanding of that broader obligation, we realised that the skills and the capabilities that we had could make a very substantial contribution to enhancing equality and opportunity for Indigenous Australians as well. Now, that's when we got together. This is before my time on Reconciliation Australia board, but we got together with Reconciliation Australia as they rolled out the RAP program, Reconciliation Action Plans, which give business a model for planning their engagement with Indigenous communities, because this is not something that necessarily comes natural to business. Some businesses have got a long history in Indigenous engagement. Many would like to, but simply haven't got the experience or capability. So the RAP model provided the framework, if you like, for us to think about what might a business like KPMG do. So we have, for example, terrific skills in how to run a business, how to set up a business, how to govern a business. And through our RAP and our partnership with Jarwin, we found ways to deliver that capability into a whole range of Indigenous communities across Australia, from the Shepparton area, from La Perouse to Cape York to the Kimberley. We are, through Jarwin and under our RAP, placing our people and their capability into Indigenous communities to support local businesses, to support local initiatives, and not only support them, but provide for long-term skills transfer as well. And that's what economic empowerment is really about. It's equipping Indigenous businesses, Indigenous peoples with the skills and capabilities to strike out independently and gain that capacity to develop their businesses going forward so they can operate successfully in the broader economy. So that delivery of our skills into community has been one aspect of our RAP, as have a range of employment initiatives in our business, education initiatives, as well as procurement initiatives. So really a broad range of activity, Jennifer, that we think is completely consistent with the prosperity of KPMG. So there is no difference between our prosperity and the prosperity of the communities in which we operate. Those two things are perfectly aligned from our perspective.
And what are you seeing across the business community? I mean, it's sort of, you've got a pretty good sense of what's happening across all sectors of the economy. What are some of the big changes you've observed?
Well, in the Indigenous space in particular, I think there is many more organisations increasingly coming to the understanding and looking at what type of a difference they can make and what sort of engagement they can have. As I said, many of them have that understanding built into their organisation, so can push forward quite quickly. Many, though, need a lot of help, and they don't come with the cultural understanding or sensitivity. So whilst many Indigenous communities are reaching out to business for help, I think you'll find many businesses will be seeking assistance or guidance from community as to how best to help as well. I think we're very conscious of not forcing solutions on, but working with. So more and more businesses are looking to that sort of engagement.
Thanks, Peter. David, tell us about what Westpac are doing. I mean, you're running the business that supports businesses, and talk to us about the lessons you've learned and how creating kind of businesses is kind of part of Westpac's, I guess, focus in the Indigenous space.
Great. Well, first of all, let me start by saying I'm really very, very grateful to be here. And as some of you could pick up from my accent, I'm not actually American. I'm Canadian. Nothing would be wrong if I were American. It just happens.
Well, then we're feeling friendlier now.
But it's I mean, it's really an honor for me to be here. And I've been here for 24 hours, so I can't possibly pretend to be an expert on this panel. I'm here to listen. I'm here to learn. But I have a microphone in front of me, so I'll give you my views anyway. Also just wanted to say that I'm really grateful for how welcoming everyone has been to me, and to, I think we have 21 people from Westpac here, so thank you to the Yulnu people and the Gumach people within that. So of course we are, as many of you would know, Australia's oldest company. We turned 200 this year, and we are awfully committed to Australia's First Peoples. And that commitment really comes in three sort of major streams. The first is, of course, a commitment we've had to employment parity. We're a major employer. We employ 40,000 Australians, and we've committed to parity. And I can't announce this yet, but I do hope this year that we'll be in a position to announce that we have in fact reached parity, and that's been there's been a lot of work from a lot of people over a long period of time for us to get into that position, and we're very, very proud of that. Secondly, we aren't doing so well on supplier relationships and this whole notion of parity in procurement. That's something we're working on, but we're not at parity yet, and we have a lot of policies in place to try to make headway on that target. I don't like missing targets, and so we're not happy with not being where we wanted to be at this point. And then finally, and you pointed this, I'm really passionate about business and the role a bank can play in supporting business and supporting Australian business. And I want to talk a bit about that. But you asked specifically about learnings, and we have many, and far too many for me to go point by point. But I'll talk about a couple. And the first of those, I think, is a learning around employment and reaching employment parity. And the learning is simple, and it's this. We started with the idea that it was about targets and the idea that we should be giving targets out to our people to hit. And we ended on the idea that it's about a culture of inclusion. And if we get the right culture of inclusion, the targets begin to hit themselves. And I think we learned this most dramatically when we faced parity, gender parity. And in that situation, again, we started with targets, and we learned that it was actually about creating an environment, a work environment, where women felt comfortable not just being employed, but being leaders in the company. And just by the way, I hold the view that the single greatest economic policy of the last 50 years has been the economic policy of inclusion. And inclusion helps those who are excluded, but it helps those who were always included as well. And why is that? Well, because when an excluded person is included in the economy, they bring their creativity, their passion, their capabilities, their energy, and their productivity, and that goes into the economy, and everybody gets to take that productivity. So it helps everyone. So, of course, does pay parity help women? It does, but it helps men as well. It helps us all, and I think if you go into the future and the big opportunity, it's around an inclusion of Indigenous people, much like the inclusions we've seen come in the past. I also just want to talk about banking specifically, and there's been 3 lessons that I'll speak to. The first is it's different. And I think we started with the idea that we could bank an Indigenous business in much the same way that we could bank any business. And we discovered that that was partially true, but it wasn't enough. And so it wasn't just about products or about our services, but it was started with understanding the culture in which the business operated, and until we could understand the culture and the cultures actually within which the business is operating, we couldn't be good bankers, and we couldn't certainly be good partners. And so that was a key learning. We also had to bring the whole bank to bear. So again, not just about making loans and taking deposits, but around we have expertise in things like cash flow management, and that was such a big idea around managing cash flow and retained earnings. You know, we're the second biggest company in the economy. We retain 30% of our earnings because that's how you grow and that's how you maintain stability. And of course, corporate governance was another area that we thought we needed to bring more of. And then finally, we had to talk about this notion of trust. And to bank an Indigenous business, we've learned that we need to build trust over years. It's a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year period of building trust before you can be the right partner and the right banker. So sort of learning 1 was, it was different. Now learning 2, conversely, is, but it's also the same. And as a bank, we've learned whenever we want to specialize in any segment, whether it be healthcare or education or professional services, we've learned that we need to have scale and we need to specialize bankers so they begin to understand over time how the whole industry works. And so we couldn't just say to all of our bankers, right, go forth and hit these targets. We had to change the structure of the bank to accommodate a specialization within Indigenous banking. So it was different. We also learned quite humbly that we don't have all the answers and we don't have all the capabilities, and we had to find partners. And I think a great example is Manny Rivers, and we've been supporting them for years. In fact, I think today we announced a $2.25 million additional support to Manny Rivers, which we're very, very proud of the work they do and the customers they serve. They specialize in microfinance, but they do it on the ground. They do it in remote communities that we don't have people on the ground. And so we learned that we couldn't do it ourselves, but we had to partner. But let me end on one final point, which I think is important, which is banks are a corporate. And I think banks should be expected to behave in the way that any big corporate should be expected to behave, and whether that be a corporate philanthropy, although I agree with you, that's not the solution, whether it be employment parity, whether it be procurement parity. But banks are different as well. And I want to give you an example, just to use the example of the Westpac group. So we bank under 4 brands. We have the largest number of customers in the economy. We bank 50% of the nation's businesses. And when we think of a bank, we often think about the branch, and we think about a consumer bank, and we think about mortgages and credit cards and deposits. But a business bank is different. And fundamentally, the business bank has, and this is the same for Westpac, it's the same for our competitors as well. We survive because businesses thrive. And fundamentally, our economics are aligned to the success of the businesses that we serve. Now, as soon as you realize that, then you ask, well, how do we serve those businesses? We serve them in a lot of ways. Through some expertise, through deposits, but primarily we serve them by investing our balance sheet in those businesses. And as soon as we have our balance sheet in the business, suddenly our economics are aligned with the success of that business, and therefore we're going to throw the entire weight of our capabilities behind making that business successful. And so I guess what I want to leave you with is banks are corporates, but they're different than corporates. And a business bank, if you want a business bank to truly support, We have to get the business banks to put their balance sheet invested in Indigenous businesses. And then suddenly it's not a matter of corporate philanthropy, it's a matter of basic economics, and the whole bank will follow. So if I had one thing we could do more of as an industry, not just as Westpac, it would be get our balance sheets involved, get our skin in the game, and then give us the perfect economic incentive to make sure that everything we know gets put into Indigenous businesses so they can be as successful as possible.
Thanks, David. So just turning to you, Mark, Perpetual is playing a bigger role now in working with Indigenous groups to grow and manage their wealth. Talk to us about how the private sector can build capability of groups to manage wealth and manage wealth creation.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think, to build on David and Peter's points, I think to start off, I think you've got to look at the First Nations, communities and the corporations, see the real advantages of working with these communities, and pick up on something you talked about, which is the concept of return. And I think for Australian corporations today, without that actual concept of a social licence, it's very hard to build a return on economic profit alone. And as we heard earlier today, I think it was Eddie talking earlier today about this concept of a return not just being in an economic sense, but also an ROI in terms of the cultural, the education, the sacred sites and the land being a critical part of what's actually needs to be generated by corporations and communities. And I see this great advantage for Australian corporations to start moving their own idea of ROI to be actually in line with some of these communities overall. Now, we work with some 19 communities across Australia today. That's over $1 billion worth of assets alone, notwithstanding the value of their land, which I would put in the priceless category overall. And there's three key ways I think corporations can continue to really work with these communities and support them on the journey that's ahead. And I'd start with the first one being bridging the gap. And as what we find in the communities and corporations is that what we do in our day-to-day lives in corporations is not all there yet. The governance, the financial advisory, the corporate advisory, and there's a great opportunity for corporations through bodies like Jarwin, through other opportunities like the trustee businesses to really provide those gaps and start working to maximise the returns. We worked with one trustee business about a year ago, and in a very short space of time we're actually able to look through their supply chain. Again, a very simple concept in a corporation sense of looking through lean and continuous improvement, take out over $1 million worth of vendor cost and turn that corporation from someone that was actually draining their corpus base into a corporation that then started to actually pay dividends back into their future fund. There's sort of the opportunities that I think exist in our natural way of doing business within corporations that we can bring to communities and corporations today. It's a very big part of it, as is the fact that our corporations in many respects can provide a very large bridging between the philanthropy side and not-for-profits that exist across Australia today and the communities and corporations. And for a lot of communities, it's very hard to get their story across on what they're looking to invest in, trying to understand the tender process that's actually involved, to understand the key makers in the business. And again, we can play a very important role in bridging between the two. The second one I'd probably turn to is very key as well, which is beginning with the end in mind. And without a doubt, as you've heard all morning, the sense of an autonomous culture over time is absolutely something that corporations must think about and start building in today. Autonomy and financial independence will only come when the education, the governance and the tertiary qualifications of these communities is at a point that they can take complete control end to end. And that is without a doubt one of the aspirations that all these communities have. Now that's quite a long exercise to work through today. If you start digging into it as we have, what we start finding is tertiary bodies such as the Law Society have actually taken a huge step forward. We're seeing huge amounts of graduates starting to come through the universities now. A lot of the law firms are doing a fantastic job with internships and catering for the specific needs of Indigenous graduates to ensure that they are encouraged, mentored, to allow them to go and grow on the journey over time. Unfortunately, finance and accounting both doesn't have the same heroes, but also is well behind in terms of that journey overall. And to give you an example of that, there'd only be 17 graduates coming out of the WA university system this year. So a lot of the education process that really needs to be stepped up now so that we can have that view of filling some of these corporations and communities with the right financial controllers, with the right people to act in a trustee role, is something that we really need to focus on from here. Now, the third one for me is a quite critical one, which is building the product. And again, we heard this morning, a critical issue for a lot of communities and corporations is the downturn in the mining industry overall. We are not seeing the same level of mining entitlements coming through that were in place some 4 years ago. And that trend is going to continue. That's a fact of life. But as the governance, the quality of corporate advisory starts to build, to David's point, with the actual improvements coming from the banking cycle, from the banking sector, and improvements really in the appetite from superannuation funds and other bodies to actually invest in social venture schemes, there's a real need for greater focus on product that actually bridges between those superannuation funds and actually brings to life the aspirations of communities and corporations, and how superannuation funds have a real appetite to invest in vehicles that will actually may return a slower return, but the social return is far higher. And we're seeing a huge appetite for that, not just in philanthropic circles, but across the superannuation industry as a whole, remembering that there is $3 trillion in money sitting in that superannuation industry today that is looking for a home and looking for investments, and their member base is more and more aware of this social licence as well. And I think the corporations such as ours play an important part of the glue in actually creating that product, bringing it to life and market, working with the expertise that exists in Indigenous community today, and actually finding the supply chain that is looking for products like that in the future.
Thanks, Mark. So just a question for everyone, starting with you, Peter. In this space, what do you think business can do that government can't? And how do you think business and government might collaborate better together? And I know you're a big supporter of the Empowered Communities initiative, so perhaps just mention that.
Yep, I'll certainly come to the empowered communities, but I think in this space, more businesses need to do more, and in the hard spaces as well. And employment for many businesses is one of those difficult areas. So that would be an area where I think business can make a huge contribution, and it's a matter of going to the next step. So Mark points out the difficulty in getting finance graduates or technology graduates. Now, at KPMG, we could set our targets and then bemoan the fact that the university system is not producing graduates at that rate, so poor us, we can't recruit and it's not our fault. Or we can sit down and work with the universities to understand how we would encourage more Indigenous students into different types of business degrees and technology degrees to increase that supply, if you like, to offer scholarships, to offer internships, to offer placements, and that's something that the private sector has to do. The idea that the government sector will provide the jobs that will solve the challenge is a nonsense, and so that's business going that next step to do the hard piece. On empowered communities, empowered communities is a fantastic model that has been developed amongst a number of communities that will enable them really a greater level of self-determination in terms of how programs and funding are delivered into their communities. Now, absent assistance and working with high-level capability from business, both to formulate the notion and the conceptual or the construct of empowered communities, and then the ongoing support of how to execute and how to put that in place, that is made all the harder for those communities. So for us, in that case, where we worked very closely in Shepparton with the Yorta Yorta people to help with the design of the empowered community model there, it's not just a matter of saying, well, we'll leave you to it, off you go. It's really a matter of being there for the long run, because again, that is a model that will deliver prosperity and empowerment to that community, and that is something that all of business and all of the community more broadly benefits from.
Thanks. David?
Well, I mean, I agree very much with what Peter was saying, and maybe I'll fall a bit short of offering the government advice. Although
Why not? Everyone else does.
I do acknowledge it that I've learned that is possibly Australia's favourite national pastime. But I will point out a fact, which may or may not be useful for government or for business, or for those thinking about these issues. But the fact is this: when you look at this stage, and when you look at corporate involvement, it has seemed to stay within the confines of major national corporates. And the fact is this: though we have 3 corporates on the stage, and though corporates can afford to support, corporates are actually quite a small sliver of the economic activity in Australia. And the majority of the economic activity in Australia is not coming through corporates. It's the heartland of business is commercial businesses, down to small businesses, 5 to 25 people and staff, and micro businesses, 1 person to 5 people. And we use the expression micro, but the way I think of it is the smaller the business, the more important it is to the person who owns it. And so that's the action. And the majority of the growth right now in this economy, the amazing growth story of the past 12 months actually, has been that small and medium-sized businesses are carrying the majority of the growth for our economy. In fact, over the last year to date, in our book, small businesses are growing 4 times the pace in terms of credit growth as the rest of the economy. So that's where the action is. And I really worry that we're just limiting ourselves to corporates and forgetting that fact. And why is that important? It's important because when we talk about commercial sustainability, and you start applying it to trying to include medium-sized businesses, we know these businesses. They don't have free cash floating about. They're on lines of credit to afford payroll. Any free cash they have, they're reinvesting in their company because the digital economy is moving so quickly, they've got to reinvest to keep up with it. And so we cannot ask them to participate in a philanthropic way. We have to make it commercially viable. And so I guess what I would say is the fact is the action in the Australian economy right now is medium and small businesses, not corporates. And if you want to include them in tackling these issues, we have to find a sustainable model. And maybe, if I end on the government, that's something the government could use.
Thanks, Mark. Some observations from you?
Yeah, look, I come back to this concept of risk and return, and I think governments, we've heard a lot today about bureaucracy. I think part of it is we've got to acknowledge their role is not to take risk. They're actually looking 50 years ahead, and unfortunately their processes are designed to think about that. But if you look at some of the areas around innovation, they've been very supportive in terms of tax incentivisation, to start thinking about the agenda and pushing for companies and corporations which do take on risk to actually get out there and have a go. And I think that may be a model that they could apply across other areas such as the Indigenous corporations and communities more so than where they are today, to actually assist and incentivise other corporations, communities, super funds to actually start placing more money into this. As I say, I think the greatest risk for Indigenous corporations and communities is that they are very asset rich and very cash flow poor. And that's going to be the greatest challenge for them over the next 10 years. There's a real opportunity here for government to actually get out of the way, a bit similar to what they're taking as an approach with the innovation side of the community, the society right now.
Great. Well, I'm conscious of time and that we stand between you and something else. So I might hand back to Marcia just to sum up, and perhaps Marcia, as part of that, just give your observations of the role of the corporate sector in Indigenous economic development. Thanks. Yeah.
So, Mark, isn't it? Yeah, Mark just said something very, very important. He said the Indigenous community is asset rich, well, especially, the kinds of institutions we're talking about here, the businesses and so on. Asset rich, but cash flow poor, capital poor. So let's just have a look at the assets. So I said earlier today that through the Land Rights Act, about 53% of the Northern Territory has been returned to Aboriginal ownership. And of course, some people might think that's extraordinary, but remember that I think it's by 2030, 50% of the Indigenous population, at least, will be Indigenous. And, when you're in this part of the world, especially outside of the towns, 80% Indigenous anyway. So across Australia at the moment, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the land mass is owned by Indigenous entities in one form or another. Now, that's a huge block of assets, massive. The problem is, as Gulkula pointed out this morning, many of these titles are fragile titles, and this is what he was saying to you when he talked about the need for a title that he himself had control over. He doesn't have control over his title in the way that you freehold land title owners have control over your title. Even if you own a strata apartment, you have more control over your title than a traditional owner does, because there are layers of bureaucracy and you can't often get the outcome that you want. So just say here on this area, you had to apply under the Land Rights Act for a Section 19A lease to build this. Well, you might wait 3 years and you might actually be knocked back by, somebody with a bitchy attitude and a bit of, jealousy of what the Gumach are doing. They could knock you back. That happens every day, right? And you'd never be able to build this. But they have a secure lease here that results from, strangely enough, the mining industry. So that's why this was built, and why all of the facilities here, if you have a look around this area, see, this is an Aboriginal-owned area, look at all the facilities and think about how much all of this costs. You've got, your kitchen, your generators, you've got your mining training camp up the back, you've got your knowledge centre, you've got electricity supply, you've got massive water tanks and water reticulation that meet, all the standards. I could go on and on. Good roads, electricity, ablution blocks. What do you think that's worth? Well, it's worth, I don't know, at least $15 million here that you're enjoying. Well, so the capital is very hard to get. It's taken 18 years to get that investment here. So that's less than $1 million a year. We need fast injections of capital. And that means, exactly as the panel members have said, and exactly as Jennifer has said, sorry about calling you the chairman, you are the CEOs, my apologies. Always happy to be promoted. I'd promote you. We need the government to step aside and actually become more efficient and stop interfering and stop, holding us back with ridiculous rules. Yeah. And we need the private sector to move in. We will have much greater efficiency. We'll be able to wield these assets, move them into the economy, and build initiatives like this. It took real entrepreneurialism to build up the Garma Festival to what it is today. Not to put too fine a point on it, most governments, with a few exceptions, and I commend the Northern Territory government for their Indigenous employment policy and their procurement policy, most governments have historically locked us into a protection model. We're not good enough or smart enough to have a real title, so our titles are burdened and therefore weak. We're not good enough to get a real education, so I challenge you to look at some of the schools around here. And you've talked about the rates of graduation from universities as it happens, and I think I can say this in public. Pro-Vice-Chancellor Engagement and Professor of Indigenous Higher Education from the University of Melbourne, my mate Ian Anderson there. And I met recently with the business deans of Australia, the deans of the business schools of Australia, and put an argument to them about engaging Indigenous people and turning out more graduates through the business schools. And we asked them, how many of you are doing something already? And more than half of them put their hands up. So that gave us terrific encouragement, because we didn't find that in the other disciplines. And Ian pointed out that it took quite a while to get the Deans of Medicine over the line to build up the Indigenous health workforce. And he was the initiator of all of those initiatives. so that now we've got, I think, 200 doctors, right? More? 250 Indigenous doctors, but it took 10 years to get there, 20 years to get there. Can we just go a bit faster, please? So this is what we need. We need everybody engaged, and we need an end to the, discourse of low expectations. We need a lot of the young people that you're meeting here to finish their degrees, not be held back, do it quickly, and get careers. The jobs are there. When I spoke to the Business Council of Australia people a few years ago when I was working with Andrew Forrest on the Forest Review, they said, we've got the jobs, it's just that government is so inefficient in the way that they manage the subsidies for Indigenous employment. And I think there's still a problem, isn't there? There's still a problem. Can we just, get rid of the red tape and all move a lot faster? Because if you heard those stories this morning, that mob came in from the desert in 1986, and you listened to the last woman left standing out of that group. Now, I can draw a straight line from 1986 to that mortality rate. I can draw a straight line. It is about empowerment, it's about education, it's about respect, and it's about all of those things that were discussed here today from the private sector. So we've got to stop the naivety and the vanity about Aboriginal affairs. There's a practical job to be done. People's lives depend on it, and thank God the corporate sector's here with doing this marvellous work with their reconciliation action plans, their employment targets, their parity initiatives, their willingness to get in and do the hard yards on building the Indigenous supply chain, and a professional workforce. And I thank you all for your very great contribution over time and also here on this panel today. And I'm going to make a recommendation to the Yothu Yindi Foundation that we put these discussions, I've said it before, at the beginning of the day and the politicians at the end. Thank you so much.